Hey, listen, you see this little game we have over here?
Yeah.
That's what they call the African Dodger.
Oh.
Now, I usually have a little color boy that stands behind there, places his head in the hole, and the natives come along and throw the balls at them.
Oh.
I sell them 3 balls for a nickel.
Who doesn't love a fun day at the amusement park? Well, with roller coaster safety issues being reported more frequently now, maybe a lot less people enjoy theme parks than in prior decades. But there was a time when, collectively, we were blissfully ignorant about the potential dangers at amusement parks and just went to have a good time. In the United States, adventure parks have existed in some form since the 1840s, and before that, there were always fairs, carnivals, festivals, and even church bazaars that people could attend to ride a ride, eat some calorie-laden treats, or play some games in order to win some prizes, or not even win prizes. And one of those games has a history in this country that goes back as far as amusement parks themselves. The game is called African Dodger. This is how it is played. The player pays a small price, usually a nickel or so, then is given 3 objects to throw at a target. The object might be something as soft as a raw or boiled egg. It could be something as hard as a softball, a rock, or a baseball. If the player hits the target, he or she might win a prize, like a stuffed animal, a cigar, or maybe a little money. Or, if the target is very unfortunate, the player with good aim might win more throws after successfully hitting the target. And the target was most typically a black male, young or old, who volunteered to be the target, or the African Dodger. The African Dodger would stand behind either a very thick canvas sheet or thick cardboard or thin wood with a hole cut out just large enough for him to stick his head through in order to show his face to the player or thrower. The player would aim and throw. The African Dodger would do his best to remove his face from the hole before whatever was being thrown could hit him. Most often, the player would miss. But when they didn't, the results for the African Dodgers could be serious. Black eyes, broken noses, busted lips, broken and missing teeth, or even broken bones. But before you get too angry about it, keep this in mind. Most of the African Dodgers volunteered to do the job. The pay was actually not bad. From the 1880s until the 1920s, it wasn't uncommon for a Dodger to earn more per day than unskilled laborers, and they could do so in less time than an 8-hour shift. So if you didn't mind taking the risk of bruises to your face and ego, it could have been worth it. But that was for the voluntary African Dodger. Like I said, most wanted to do the job, but a few did not. They were toddlers and animals. Monkeys. A poor family might volunteer their own small child to be used in the same game, African Dodger, that also went by a more offensive name, Hit the Nigger Baby. And when amusement park owners and carnival managers couldn't find a willing black male or a black family desperate enough to allow their child to be used for the game, they would resort to using monkeys. At least the human Dodger could run away if that's what it took to avoid whatever projectile was being hurled in his direction. The monkeys, however, were chained to a post behind the canvas. Thankfully, the practice of using animals was eventually seen as inhumane, even by most of the people who were so base as to find this game entertaining. But well into the 1960s, the use of willing black men allowed the game to continue being played. And even as early as the 1910s, it started to morph into a less violent but equally degrading game called Drop the Chocolate Drop. In this iteration of the game, the player now aimed at a target that was usually a plate of some sort, while the black male or chocolate drop or coon sat on a seat above a pool of water. If the player struck the target, the chocolate drop's seat would retract or quickly lower, thus dropping him into the water. which was the best possible outcome because he would have been perceived to be dirty and in need of a bath. And for those who loved African Dodger but couldn't find a fair or a carnival or amusement park where they could play it, they had no need to fear, for there was also a home version of the game. Let's get into it. But first, if you like these videos about the most scandalous topics from yesteryear that make Ty's Hot Mess History a time capsule for the culture, subscribe and hit the notification bell so that you can know every time that I upload one of these videos or every time that I live stream. And hit that like button to support this video. Thank you. Now, on to why you are here. By the 1880s, the African Dodger game was so popular in America that when mentioned in newspapers, it didn't need an introduction or an explanation of the rules. An 1881 article from the Indiana Herald wrote about the cruelty that a monkey suffered when no willing black men showed up to play the role of the Dodger at a local fair. Quote, "There is a new Dodge in the African Dodger line this year. In place of the burnt cork artist, who heretofore has been in the habit of sticking his head through a hole made in the canvas background, a man has substituted a monkey. This little animal has been placed on a table, chained to a center post, and is there made the target for the throwing of balls shied by men intent only on hitting the innocent creature. If a man is disposed to make a fool of himself and run the chances of being hit, all well and good. But for any man to put an animal in such a position, it is a shame and an outrage. It is nothing less than a severe case of cruelty to animals, and such should be prohibited by the management of the grounds." End quote. The writer went on to explain that the monkey in this story escaped into the trees on the grounds, but was later coaxed down by its owner and chained back to the post. He went on to write that the animal owner should have been fired, and basically called the troglodytes who found the activity to be amusing thoughtless cowards. In 1884, the Sun Journal wrote about an African Dodger in a manner that was typical of the time, using terminology that would be considered racially degrading and describing someone who was of below average intelligence. Quote, "The African Dodger, the darky who sticks his head through a hole in a canvas wall and lets you throw baseballs at him, said they had hit him so few times this morning that he hadn't barely woke up." End quote. Words like darky, woolly-headed, coon, the N-word, fool, and clown were commonly used in news articles describing the goings-on of African Dodgers. In 1885, the Sun Journal again had a story about a number of acts at a particular carnival. Regarding the African Dodger, it was written that, quote, 50 cents if you're hit mama's darling in the head. Here you go, the only original African Dodger imported from his native clime, West Virginia. He has no plate on the top of his head, nothing but his own woolly head. This is what greets every man, woman, and child arriving at the main entrance of the grounds. We look with curiosity to see who Mama's darling is. There stands a Negro 6'6" with a mouth from ear to ear. A front tooth is gone, and through this aperture he squirts a stream 1/4 of an inch in diameter. 3 for $10 and 50 cents if you hit him on the head. One customer stepped up, and the black imp sticks his head through the hole in the canvas. Whack, whack, whack. End quote. The story went on to say that the woolly head was struck, and it sounded like a sledgehammer hitting a ledge. Then in December of 1893, Bloomingdale's ran a sale on the home version of the game, just in time for little ones all over the country to practice hitting a Negro in the head by Christmas morning. It was advertised as, quote, one of the new toys this season, end quote, and it sold for a very affordable 69 cents. Adjusted for inflation, that's roughly $24 today in 2023. And then, in 1903, there was a Midway, which is just a touring exhibition show, that went through Buffalo, New York. This one was the Sprudel's show, and it was supposed to be an attraction for history lovers. Among its attractions were a carriage that belonged to George Washington and another carriage built for the Queen of Spain in 1712. But according to the Buffalo Courier, the first thing that a ticket holder would see would have been the African Dodger exhibit. Quote, "The first thing to be seen upon entering the Midway is darkest Africa. There can be found one of the cleverest African dodgers in captivity. If one so wishes, he may toss baseballs at the dodger's head. If he hits the head once, he gets a cigar. Twice, 2 cigars, and so on. Anyone cracking the dodger's skull gets arrested. Nobody was arrested yesterday, but the Sprudels have hopes." End quote. And yes, you heard that correctly. It would have been against the law to crack the dodger's skull, but it would have been great press to help boost ticket sales if anyone had happened to do it. The first mention that I could find of the less violent version of the game was in 1911, when the Washington Herald published an article about an amusement park in Chicago, which featured a new version called Drop the Chocolate Drop. Now, while the game had become less brutal than its predecessor, it was still equally demeaning. When the Herald's story went out, it was called Human Dummies. Quote, "The drop of chocolate in this case is of the African persuasion. Above a tank of water, upon a trap door, sits a jolly colored man. Connected with the trap at one side is a flat target, about the size of a dinner plate. The trick is to see if you can hit the target with a thrown ball. The hit trips the trap door, tumbling the chocolate drop into the water. The water does him good, to be sure, and being paid well for his dummy service, he seems to enjoy the fun. There are 2 such traps side by side, so that when one victim is scrambling around and trying to get out of his water tank, another is in position and waiting for his turn to be tumbled. A continuous performance." End quote. Now, the jolly colored man isn't the only dummy in this story, or rather, both jolly colored men side by side, getting ready to be tumbled into tanks. The other dummies were Japanese men who were chess pieces on a colossal chessboard, told to move by the players who controlled them. The games could last as long as 3 days. But just because Drop the Chocolate Drop was the new game in Chicago, that didn't mean that the rest of the nation had followed suit just yet. Chicago was ahead of the times. 6 years later, in 1917, the New York Age published a story about proposing an anti-African Dodger bill for consideration in the state of New York. The New York Age was one of the most prominent black newspapers of its time, and many of its readers felt so strongly in support of the proposed legislation that they were compelled to write letters to the editor. One of those letters was from a reader named Ernest G. Hebbins, and he wrote, quote, "I, too, have been thoroughly disgusted with that phase of Negro employment. Personally, I have never been to Coney Island, and had no idea that they had such there. Since that is a fact, judging from the number of our people that frequent that popular resort, it must indeed be a constant menace to the great mass of Negroes. I have only seen it in and around the New York at Palisade Park, on the Hudson. I once lived within a few blocks of that park, and it was a constant pleasure for me to run down there every once in a while, until I saw this much discussed African Dodger. A great sense of shame came over me as I saw the many persons taking chances at his head. Before I would submit to such an indignity, or take advantage of such an act to demonstrate my pitching ability, I would cast my every nickel in the nearby natatorium." End quote. Many readers of the New York Age wrote in to express their second-hand embarrassment regarding the black men who chose this line of work. Even though it was 1917, there was other work available, which was clearly expressed in the letters written to the publication. Though taking up the role of the Dodger was almost exclusively done by black males, there were exceptions. And I'm not referring to the monkeys who had no choice. In 1922, the Democrat and Chronicle wrote 2 stories about a little black girl who played the role of an African Dodger. The first story was published on May 13th, and the second on May 14th. On Friday, May 12th, the First Methodist Church was having a carnival. The church's carnival had an African Dodger booth. A little black girl walked onto the grounds and offered to play the Dodger, and the game went on just the same as if she had been a man. The church used rubber balls as the projectile for her to dodge. White children, women, and men paid to get their chance to hit her, until a white police officer showed up to check out the Holy Christian Carnival. When he saw the Dodger booth, he shut it down. End of story. Until the 14th, when the Reverend himself made a statement to defend his church's disgusting attraction. Quote, Reverend Herbert G. Bergstaller, pastor of the First Methodist Church, North Fitz High Street, characterized the so-called African Dodger game that was closed by a policeman at the Epworth League Carnival on Friday evening at the church as an innocent, wholesome game, and said that the suppression was due to the efforts of certain interests in Rochester that are out to muzzle the churches. Mr. Bergstaller said the game that received police attention offered no danger at all to the young girl who took the part of the Dodger. Soft rubber balls were thrown, and the carnival was mainly for children. It is not customary for detectives to go to church carnivals in search of evil, which I am sure is more likely to be found and could be found in other places in Rochester, said Reverend Bergstaller. The animosity which actuated this action is thoroughly understood. He promised that he would have something to say on gambling and other law-breaking in his sermon this evening. End quote. And yes, this story was printed on a Sunday. So, according to the good old Reverend, African Dodger was nothing more than good, wholesome Christian family fun. Mainly kids were throwing balls. Just a few men. No real harm. After all, everybody was just throwing soft rubber balls. Well, putting aside the fact that a rubber ball hitting your face can still be very dangerous, another thing about African Dodger is that sometimes the players would bring their own balls to play the game, and they were often hard metal balls. But as far as this reverend was concerned, stop harassing the church from spreading the gospel and go find some real criminals. You know, like gamblers. I'll be preaching about them tonight. Drop by and listen and bring a little something to put into the collection plate. Anyone who would allow children to participate as an African Dodger was morally reprehensible. Whether it was a carnival owner or manager, parents looking for a little extra money, or a reverend of all people. But there was another way that children were exposed to African Dodger. For those who had never played the part of an African Dodger or seen an African Dodger stall in a carnival or an amusement park, there were cartoons. Donald Duck was pictured in a cartoon strip buying his 3 African Dodger balls for 5 cents. And when Bluto failed to impress Olive Oyl with his African Dodger throwing skills, Popeye came to the booth and put him to shame. He used every ball in the stall, and each one hit the target flawlessly and effortlessly. African Dodger is a part of American history. It never went away. It just evolved. And when it became the drop the chocolate drop version, everybody got in on it. Dunk tanks at carnivals, amusement parks, and fairs featuring white adults and even children was not an uncommon thing to see. I even recall seeing an episode of Little House on the Prairie where Laura and her arch-nemesis, Nellie Olson, were the sitting targets of a dunk tank. And yes, with the dunk tank, there was a humiliation factor involved, but it wasn't inherently harmful or racial. White men dressed as clowns or even children who were raising money for their schools would play the dummy in these setups. But even decades after the 1930s, African dodger existed in some parts of the country in its original form, and under its more offensive names. And in the states that insisted on the game being racially degrading, even after black men finally stopped volunteering to be the dodger, the target became a mechanical wooden African figurine with exaggerated features, like very large eyes and lips and extremely wide noses. In many cities across the country, the chocolate drop exhibit didn't go away until after the height of the civil rights movement, and even then, that wasn't due to any legislation. It was the result of enough people getting around to thinking that the attraction was in poor taste. The African Dodger game was an example of racial inhumanity, even though some black people were willing participants. But there was another example of racial mistreatment that black people imposed upon each other based on skin complexion. This is discussed at length in my video about the Blue Vein Society, which consisted of people who were black and partially black who saw themselves as inferior to white people, but superior to people who presented as fully black with darker skin. You can see that video here. I will leave a link to it in the description box. My sources for this story are the Indiana Herald Archives, 1881, Sun Journal Archives, 1884 and 1885, the World Archives, 1893, Buffalo Courier Express Archives, 1903, the Washington Herald Archives, 1911, the New York Age Archives, 1917, Democrat and Chronicle Archives, 1922, and Poughkeepsie Eagle News Archives, 1935. This video has been brought to you by me. Well, my Patreon is a sponsor for this video. If you like these dirty scandals on my channel, then you'll love my Patreon, Ty's Too Hot Hot Mess History. It has all of the stuff that I can't talk about or show here because it's just too hot, too violent, too sexual, too graphic, too much. Come and join us there for the hot mess history. The link is in the description box.